The first step in making the little pouch is to create a seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on 3 sides of the rectangle. I want you to keep one of the short sides open. Here I have my first step completed. Please note that I made a mistake when I was turning and I did not follow the seam allowance. So after I finished, I went ahead and corrected that. And now I'm going to go ahead and trim the edges just so that the sample looks neater. Notice that the seam over here is folded that way, so I'm gonna make sure that this side is folded the same direction, just like that. And so now I can go ahead and reverse it to look at the pouch on the right side. And we can see that the form is slightly different. And I think I'm gonna go with the 2 centimeter pinch rather than the 4 centimeter. But the one you're gonna go with is entirely up to you. If you want to pinch it at 6 centimeters, that's gonna be probably actually somewhat awkward looking, but you can do whatever you want. I'm gonna go ahead with a 2. Surprise me with your measurements and play around. I'm gonna go ahead and reverse this back, put an actual seam with a sewing machine at 2 centimeter markings. I'm gonna go ahead and do it while my basting stitch is still there. And then since my basting stitch is done with the red thread and I'm using different color thread on my machine, I'm gonna be able to see very easily and use my seam ripper to cut the basting stitch out very, very easily. Since it's going to be very difficult for me to create a guide for the short distance, I do have a marking here, and I went ahead and placed my needle so that it's corresponding to the little mark inside the presser foot. And I'm not sure you guys can see it, but there's a little mark here in the very center of the presser foot, and I moved my needle to correspond precisely to that, and that will allow me to place my fabric correctly, to align the marking on my fabric to this little guide. And then I can put my presser foot down, and you can see that that's aligning perfectly, and I can go ahead and lock in the stitch. And now I'm going to go ahead and take out the basting stitch. And remember, because it's in red, it should be fairly easy to find it. And here it is. And there it is. There we go. So there's no more basting stitch. And now let's go ahead and reverse this and see how we did on our flat bottom, and if it's parallel and everything is looking good. And indeed, everything is looking good. Our flat bottom is perfect. All of these are lining up, and we're ready to move to the next step. So the next step in making this pouch is to fold the open edge twice and sew it shut, and then create an opening for the thread or the ribbon to pass through so that the pouch can be easily closed down. And for that, we're going to reverse the fabric to the wrong side again, where all the seams are visible. And here you're going to have some freedom in deciding how wide you want this area to be, and that will result in that will kind of guide how that visual decision will guide the practical decision of how you are folding, the distance from the edge at which you're folding. And so in my case, because we have so much length here, I'm going to go ahead and decide maybe to go with a 2 centimeter distance. And I'm going to go ahead and make the fold once and make sure that it's 2 centimeters everywhere, all around, and it appears to be somewhat 2 centimeters everywhere. Of course, we could also make that mark with a pencil or another washable material, utensil, marking utensil. So, but more or less, this has folded it 2 centimeters away from this edge, and then we're going to do the same a second time. If you have an iron, this would be a perfect time for you to iron once you measure everything for the second fold, to iron that edge, and so that there's no movement. But in our case, this is way more than 2 centimeters. In our case, we're not going to do that because most of you probably don't have an iron. But I am going to go ahead and use pins to make sure that I am going with a 2 centimeter plan. There we go. That sets my 2 centimeter measurement. I'm just going to go ahead and pin it and then proceed all around. And so now I'm gonna set up my machine and make a seam along this edge. And I'm gonna use this edge as a guide. And it's gonna line up with the right hand edge of my presser foot. And just to start practicing a little bit of finesse in our sewing, I'm gonna ask you guys to sew at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance right here. So I want the seam to be 1/8 of an inch away from this edge, okay? So because I want the smallest seam allowance possible for this, so you guys can experience a very tight seams, I ask you to do 1/8 of a distance between the edge. And what I'm finding out right now, my particular presser foot does not allow me that measurement. If you look at my tape measure and the placement, right now the needle is to its rightmost position, and the edge of the presser foot, it's actually 3/16. So it's a little bit more than 1/8, which is okay. That is, I will be perfectly satisfied with that measurement. So we're gonna go ahead and use that as our guide, this edge with the rightmost position of the needle. And let me see. I'm gonna go ahead and position, since it's a very small opening, it's gonna be somewhat awkward. I am gonna go very slow so that I can remove the pins as I'm sewing. Sometimes when you're looking at videos online, you will see people kind of going through and sewing over these pins. I do not recommend that. It's going to be very easy to break your needle by doing that. So either, if you are really worried, you can baste. You can put a running basting stitch to hold the fabric together, or you can remove the pins as we go. And you'll see that I'll be stopping quite a bit as well. I'm gonna go ahead and switch my stitch length to 2, so it's nice and short, and that will also ensure that I'm gonna go fairly slow. I'm gonna show you that I wasn't paying attention, and by accident I sewed the opening together, the two sides, and I'm gonna go ahead and fix that by ripping that seam very, very carefully. And that's why when working with tiny objects like this, you have to be fairly careful and pay attention. And there was a big machine driving outside of my house, and I got a little bit distracted by that. I'm gonna try to just cut open the seam, and it was a tiny little mistake here, and it's actually didn't really harm anything in our situation. So just opening it up like that fixed everything. And here I want to encourage you guys to remove any loose threads as you go along. It's gonna make this habit will make your sewing a lot cleaner and just better. Because most of the time, of course, you could design a piece of garment or object that encourages a lot of loose threads. But in this instance, you know, when making the samples, I'm looking for nice, clean seams without too many loose ends. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna eye the center of the pouch and just pinch it with my hands, and then I'm going to take my scissors and make a little cut like that, halfway through the 2 centimeter thickness here. And this will be the opening for the thread. Now you can, if you're using a thick ribbon, you could go ahead and cut it a little bit further down. No problem, but not all the way to the seam. Okay, and now we have to make sure that we sew close the edges so that there is not too much fraying happening. And if you see on the other sample, there's quite a bit of fraying happening right there. And I mean, for the sample, it's okay, you guys are learning how to do it, but I still want you to take a thread and go ahead and close up these edges. Remember that there is going to be one double thickness, 2 layers of fabric on one side, and I want you to make sure that you correlate that on both sides, because if you move this layer on one side, it's going to be sewn to the left, and on the other side it's going to be sewn to the right. The problem with that is that you might not be able to actually pass through your ribbon. And so I'm going to go ahead and take my needle and make this a neat edge. If you have a ribbon or a thicker thread, go ahead and feel free to use that to feed through this opening. But if you don't, not a big deal. You can take a long scrap of muslin fabric and make a cut about 1 centimeter wide away from the edge and rip a piece. And that will function as your ribbon. Go ahead and remove some of the extra loose threads, just like that. And the next step would be to feed this through the opening here. And if you have a super long needle, that is going to be super useful. So I have a short needle, but it has a really large opening. Somewhere around my house, I also have an upholstery needle, and it's about 1 foot long. Obviously, for something this size, that's not what you want, but this size is probably going to work perfect. More importantly, we want the eye to be able to accept whatever material we're feeding through. Here we have. And now we can go ahead and feed it. Now, I'm not going to feed it with a sharp edge. I'm going to feed it with the side of the eye because it's just going to be easier for me to fit it through. If you don't have a needle like this in your course kit, you can also use any kind of, if you have a piece of wire, you could tie a piece of wire around your thick kind of ribbon or so. That will also work. Kind of be creative and find something around the house that would work. And you can see that I am slowly feeding my ribbon through the opening here. And when you come to the seam areas, it's always going to be a little more difficult to feed your material through because there's lots of layers here. But just, be patient with that. And here I am coming through. There we go. Once I am out, I can release. And now I have fed my DIY ribbon material through the pouch. And let me zoom out. And here we have. So this is the sample that I want you guys to make. Okay, I want the decision on where the distance for placing the flat bottom is going to be up to you. I showed you how it looks with 2 centimeter and 4 centimeter increments. I do want this distance for the area that accepts the ribbon to be 2 centimeters. I do want you to close the edge so it does not, so the loose threads are not coming out. And what you use for the ribbon material, it's up to you. But I want you to make sure, I want to make sure that you feed your ribbon material through the opening. And now you have a lovely little pouch in your sample collection.